Rise up!
This is the Rise Up See Red podcast, all about the Arizona Cardinals and the NFL, featuring insider and outsider perspectives. Enjoy the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Now here are your hosts, Jess Root and Seth Cox.
Hello, Arizona Cardinals fans, and welcome to the latest edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. I'm your host, Jess Root from CardsWire.com, the USA Today NFL Wire site that covers the Arizona Cardinals. And we are in the middle of our opponent preview series where we have 14 shows about 14 opponents where I bring on someone who covers that other team. The plan is to get everyone from the NFL Wire, so we're kind of helping the content across the board. And this show is dedicated to the Tennessee Titans, whom the Cardinals play at home in Week 5, and as part of that early part of the schedule. Titans who are sort of rebuilding. They're in the second year with head coach Brian Callahan, brand new quarterback. And in this show, we'll talk about their 2024 season, what they've done this offseason, and what expectations are for next season. And to help me do that, since I don't know that much about the Titans, I can only give you an Arizona view of the Tennessee Titans. From TitansWire.com, one of the contributing writers over there, I've got Mark Mihalko. Mark, thank you for coming on the show. First timer. I appreciate the time, man.
Yeah, thanks, Jess, for having me. I always look forward to talking about the Titans and, getting the Titans Wire out there. I don't know how it is out in Arizona, but the fan base in Tennessee, it's a little up and down. They get excited and then next thing you know, they're jumping off the bandwagon and bags on their heads and I don't
think we've done the bags on the heads yet. I think that is something that is more Southern because you probably remember the days, like I remember the days in the 90s when the Saints were the Aints and their fans would go to the football games and wear bags on their heads.
Absolutely. Growing up a Steelers fan, it was like I never understood it, but I guess got to do what you got to do.
Awesome. So, Mark, take us through what happened last year. So we've got this 3-14 team, rookie head coach and Brian Callahan. They go with Will Levis at quarterback, but also Mason Rudolph gets some starts. And obviously there were not many expectations. Their wins came against a Miami team that was, I don't know what to expect from Miami, a Patriots team, and then a Texans team that at the time was playing poorly before they won games. And so they end up going 3-14, get the number 1 pick in the draft. What did last season look like covering a team like the Titans?
Well, last season with the Titans was interesting. Because you're right, there wasn't a ton of expectations, but the expectation was to be better than they were. And they were better, believe it or not, than their 3-14 record. Early in the season, they were in a lot of ball games leading into the fourth quarter and just couldn't close the door. And then injuries set in on their defense, especially. They went through, I think, 5 players at inside linebacker. They lost 2 starting safeties. They lost both of their starting corners. And that hurt their defense down the stretch. Offensively, Will Levis is Will Levis.
What do you know about Will Levis? Is he an NFL starting quarterback? Mel Kiper still is on the Will Levis bandwagon. He was riding, I think he is engineer of the Will Levis train.
I will tell you from watching Will Levis, and I have the unique perspective of covering the Titans, not being a fan of the Titans. So I'm a Steelers fan, but I can objectively write about the Titans and view them like a football. I love the game of football, just like I'm sure everybody out here that's listening loves football. And objectively, Levis shows signs that if he could rein in some of the recklessness, he can be a quarterback in the NFL. He's got the tools, he's got the arm strength. He, for whatever reason last year, he could not develop a chemistry with Calvin Ridley, a consistent chemistry, whatever. And then I think what a lot of people outside of the organization, maybe not the fans, I think the fans see it as well as I do. Their offensive line was absolutely terrible last year. They played more right tackles, I think, than any other team in the league. And most of them were coming off the streets. It was so bad. I mean, you think about it this way. Their starting right tackle for the majority of the season, Nicholas Petit-Frere, was cut, signed by the 49ers during the offseason, and he's been cut already before they even went to training camp.
Oh, good.
This is the guy that started the first week of the season and multiple games throughout the year, the majority of them. And all the other starters were people that they picked up off practice squads, all at right tackle. So there was such a hole at right tackle, it didn't matter who was going to play quarterback. By the time week 3, week 4 rolled around, they just wanted to get rid of the ball before they were getting. I mean, there was. I think I saw the fastest sack ever last year against Green Bay, where I don't think the lineman was out of the stance and Levis was like blindsided. You
Oh,
know,
wow.
so so that offensive line, and if you look at, and I know we're going to touch on it here in a little bit, what they did at free agency, they went out and shored up the offensive line. That was what they did first before they did anything else. So, like I said, they weren't as bad last year as their 3-14 record, but at the end of the year, they were 3-14. It's like, penalty here, interception there, fumble, terrible special teams. The special teams were an abomination last year, and which is one of the coaching changes they made this year. So, as we head away from last year, there is optimism that Brian Callahan learned from his rookie year, made changes to his staff. The new general manager came in because honestly, Rand Carthon spent a lot of money, but he didn't put a whole complete team. Like I said, the right tackle was terrible. And there are other spots on the roster where the depth was like not there. So once you couple in injuries. So I think they're going to be better this year than the 3-14 from last year. How much better? I- You know, my optimistic take is they hover around 500 for the season. So,
They
you
did
know,
they did have Tony Pollard rush for over 1,000 yards. Calvin Ridley got over
yeah,
1,000 yards. But the passing game, here's the interesting thing. They didn't have anybody else even crack 500. It was
yeah,
Calvin Ridley or nothing when it came to
right.
passing game.
But early in the see, this is where it gets a little again, it gets a little weird with Callahan in his rookie season as a head coach. Early in the season, coming out of training camp, they still had Hopkins, but Hopkins didn't take a snap during training camp. And then week 1, they put him in the starting lineup. So he was never fully healthy last year in Nashville, and then he was traded to the Chiefs mid-season. Um, it was Ridley and everything else and everybody else, but they did spread the ball around. Westbrook-Akine had, I think, 9 touchdowns. He might have only had 300-400 yards, but he was a red zone threat. Um, Early in the season, they kept trying to put Treylon Burks in there, to offset, and then he tears his ACL. So again, there were injuries everywhere, and the running game. And it was funny. I saw this the other day looking at PFF. The running game was one of the worst in the league when it came to like positive rushing plays. Yet that running game between Pollard and Spears was effective. Like they would pull off, get play after, it was almost like watching. I'm not going to say that stylistically, but it was like, you remember Barry Sanders with the Lions where he would get tackle for a loss, tackle for a loss. They rip off like 60 yards. Well, the Titans were tackle for a loss, rip off 7, 8 yards, tackle for a loss, rip off 8, 9 yards. So statistically, it was just a weird thing. And some of that was Callahan being a play caller for the first time too, understanding how to call the plays, when to call the plays. There, um, multiple. Yeah, like I said, there was a lot of work in progress last year that I'm hoping Callahan learned from. And I think, and we'll get into this again in a minute. I think bringing in Cam Ward and the way they are going about building the offense. I mean, they say it's a competition, but it's not. I think everybody knows Cam Ward's going to start the season opener.
Well, and that's the thing. It's a competition, but if Cam Ward doesn't start, that's really bad news.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think I wrote the other day, you don't draft the quarterback first overall for him to sit on the bench for a year, behind Will Levis, because that's who the competition.
It's different it's different in the case when you've got, John Kidna, like in the Cincinnati Bengals 20 years ago. But when the guy that's your starter currently is Will Levis.
Right. I mean, and so it's like, I mean, personally, I like Levis. They could have taken that, they could have rolled the dice with Levis this year after fixing their offensive line to see what they have, but they were blown away by Cam Ward. And to be honest, from what I've seen, it was the right choice. But they could have very easily traded out of that top spot and built everything else and rolled the dice. So, I mean, what they decided, and I wasn't in the draft room, but I mean, I don't know. It would depend on what teams were offering to get up there. So
let's talk offseason. Coming on next on the Rise of Syria podcast, the Star Cardinals talk. Well, let's move on and discuss what the Titans did in the offseason between the free agency and the NFL draft. That's coming on next on Rise of Syria. We're back on the Rise of Syria podcast, the Star Cardinals talk on the web, talking to Mark Mihalko from Titans Wire. And we moved to the offseason. The Titans were very busy in free agency. They did lose a few players. Not that there's necessarily people that you cared to lose. Of the guys that they released, Harold Landry, they lost a couple of guys. So Luke Gifford signs with the 49ers. He's tight end. Jerome Baker, what an interesting thing. So Ernest Jones, weird. He's a good linebacker with the Rams. I don't know why they didn't want him. Titans trade for him. Then the Titans trade him to Seattle for Jerome Baker, who was disappointing in Seattle, and then Ernest Jones was good in Seattle.
Yeah. I don't know what to make of that deal. I was sitting there the other day working on something, and I was working on a linebacker piece, because there's a competition going on. Excuse me. There's a competition going on to start next to Cody Barton, who they brought in free agency. And I was thinking about the Ernest Jones trade, and I'm like, that still, makes no sense to me. You trade. Well, the thing is, they traded a 5th-round pick to get Jones, and they got a 4th-round pick in return when they traded him away. But I don't know why if you're going to make that trade, you're going to do it for the long term. I mean, he was in a contract year. You're going to bring him in. You're going to give him. That's the only thing I could think of was they approached him to do a contract, and it was going to cost them more money than they wanted to spend to keep him. So they decided to flip him. But that was a weird part of the season. And I think that's really the time of the year where Rand Carlton lost his job, right? Because they traded Jones and Hopkins away on the same day, like an hour apart. And it looked like they were going into fire sale mode, where we're going to tear this thing down and we're going to rebuild it. Then they didn't make any other moves. Not one player was traded after that. And they had pieces that they could have flipped for, mid to late round picks, you know, to do a rebuild, but they didn't. And, which leads to the offseason, and Carthon gets fired. And probably the biggest move of the offseason was bringing in Mike Borgonzi from Kansas City as the new GM, who has come in with a totally different philosophy than Rand Carthon had. I mean, Carthon spent $228 million in one offseason and I think there was only like two players, maybe three left from that, or well, maybe there's four. Pollard, Cooper, or Ridley, I mean, not Cooper, Ridley, um, L'Jarius Sneed, who was a disappointment, and Lloyd Cushenberry, who ended up on injury reserve with a torn Achilles. Those are the only players left from the 228 million. So they've either gotten rid of them, traded them, cut them, whatever they did. Um, but they set out this offseason to rebuild the offensive line, and that's what they did at the beginning with Dan Moore and Kevin Zeitler as the two big names. Dan Moore got the big contract, a huge contract for a average offensive lineman.
Offensive line contracts were wild this offseason.
Yeah, I mean his contract was huge, and but this is something that I mean I don't know how you feel about places like PFF when they do their grades and this and that. Is yes, Dan Moore's contract is huge, but he's a huge improvement over Petit Frere, who started at right tackle. You know what I mean? So now J.C. Latham could slide back to his natural right tackle position, plug him in next to Kevin Zeitler, who's still one of the best guards in football. And now all of a sudden, you bring in even an average left tackle with an up and coming, you know, left guard in Skoronski. If Cushenberry comes back healthy, your offensive line got 100% better than it was last year, which is going to help everything, the passing game, the running game, and everything. That was the big thing they did at free agency on offense. On defense, they went a different direction. They went and they totally redid their inside linebacking room. They got rid of 5 players that it has started a game last year. They brought in Cody Barton. They have 3 young players that they're going to let fight out for that other spot. I think Otis Reese has kind of got the inside track right now, but I mean, Cedric Gray or James Williams, one of them could pull it out. And then they went and they signed a veteran and Xavier Woods in the secondary, who's not great, but he's a very steady performer. And, they also added Tyler Lockett as a wide receiver and Van Jefferson. I think what a lot of people are missing is between Zeitler, Woods, and Lockett, they brought in 3 established veterans that can help stabilize that locker room. And when things start going, like I said, they were leading in the fourth quarter in a lot of games last year. If things started going bad and there was no real veteran presence that, you know, you had Jeffrey Simmons doing everything he could, but there was nobody else that was coming in and saying, hey, calm down, we can, do this. And now I think at every level they've added a veteran that brings that their impact may be more in the locker room than it is on the field, because in every case they brought a young player in too. Besides Cam Ward, they brought, in the second round, Femi Oladejo, who's a athletic freak, still developing as an edge. But, then they brought in Kevin Winston, who I thought in the third round was a steal. If he wouldn't have missed, the majority of the season with a torn ACL at Penn State, he's probably first or second round safety coming off the board. But then they added, young receivers, Shamir Dike, Eli Ayamanor, a new tight end. So they went and like I said, they added, a veteran, and then they added youth in the same places where they added the veteran, so they can bring these guys along. Like I said, it was a very different philosophy under Borgonzi than under Rand Carthon. And they had money to spend. They still have money to spend. I think I saw the other day they still have like 32 million that they could spend right now if they wanted to. But they're not going to unless they have to. You
Well,
know,
and you also can use that carryover for next year when they're
next
a little bit
year
better
better.
team.
Exactly. So I mean, I think there are a couple players I think they might extend. Roger McCreary, their slot corner, would be one. Amar, um, the one of their safeties. Um, they could do that. Chiga Kwankabo, their starting tight end, is a free agent at the end of the year. So there are moves they can make if they want to try to get some extensions done. But that's going to be probably like closer to training camp or in training camp. Once those take place. And then you know what? That like I said, they have three young players competing for that inside linebacker spot. It doesn't look like it's working out. There's still good players on. I mean, one of your old players, Kaiser White,
I see your White's still available.
I mean, he's rumored left and right to join the Titans because he would be a good fit next to Barton and help bring those young linebackers along. So, I mean, there's a lot of ways that they could go, but it's all going to matter. The only thing that's really going to matter is how well Cam Ward performs. The first overall pick, and so far, I don't know if you've seen the stories, but he shows up at the facility at 5 a.m. before the coaching staff, trying to learn the offense. You know, just joked it's a competition, I think, in name only. I mean, that's his job to lose, and I don't.
Well, that makes sense. It makes sense. How good do you think Cam Ward's going to be?
You know, that's a
Or
good.
how good can he be in terms of a number one overall pick? What type of quarterback do you think he can be?
I think Cam Ward could be a very good quarterback. I mean, I've seen the comparisons that people throw crazy comparisons out all the time. In the last week, by Lewis Riddick, compared him to a young Mahomes. I don't see. I understand it because of the off-platform throws, some of the stuff he does, but I don't quite see that yet. I mean, but then you had Rob Rang, who's been around football forever, making a comparison to Steve McNair. And if he could,
Oh
it,
man.
and now here's the thing: if he could become that face of the franchise
Yeah.
that McNair was, he won't be the same player because McNair would run you over because he was like a tank that could
Yes, he
throw.
was.
I mean, I really like McNair. The Steelers had to play them a lot, so back then that was before the realignment. So I got to see a lot of McNair. Then he went to Baltimore, and I got to see him there too. Um, I don't know. I think Cam Ward has the ability to be a very good quarterback in the league. I don't like to make comparisons, but he can make all the throws. And I'm already seeing, and granted, it's clips from mini camps, but he already shows better chemistry with the wide receivers than Levis showed at any point last year. I don't know if that's just his. And they say that he's got a command of the offense, that, people just respond to him. And that's, before the draft, everybody talked about, Shador Sanders. And if you want to turn a franchise around, Shador did it, at three colleges or two colleges. Well, you can say the same thing about Ward, who went from Immaculate Word to Washington State, put them back on the map, and then to Miami, and had probably the greatest season any college quarterback has ever had. He led the NCAA in passing touchdowns, had like no interceptions, and looked like a totally different quarterback. Um, but I also think that journey is what keeps him out of the spotlight because he did go from Immaculate Word to Washington State to Miami. Nobody in the media got to build this whole, Jackson Dart started for what, 2, 3 years at Mississippi State. Shador, the hype machine that's in Colorado, you know, and But Ward just went about his business, put up yards, put up touchdowns, and developed. But because he was at three different schools, I think he gets viewed as, oh, he's keeps transferring. But sometimes that kind of works out, and in this case, I think it did. I mean, there are a lot of. I think today there are a lot more believers than there were February before the combine, when all the draft hype started. I mean, I kind of bought in more now. I mean, when the draft time, I was on the Travis Hunter bandwagon from when the season ended. Um, I just thought that he was the best football player, and
Yeah.
you take the best football player, and then you figure out what to do with him. But
But when you need a quarterback,
yeah, you have to go that route.
yeah.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so
yeah.
interesting. If we look at the other draft picks, round two, you get Femi Oladejo, who's still unsigned, like almost all the second round picks. Kevin Winston Jr. safety in round three. Uh, do either of those have a place to? Do you see them making an impact in year one?
Aladejo could start year one. Um, if not early in the season, by the end of the season, he could take over as one of the starters. They brought Draymond Jones in to be an edge. They brought him in for a 1 year deal, I think 1 year, $10 million. Um, but that's Aladejo's spot for the future. He's raw though, but in minicamp, of course, minicamp football in shorts. He's athletic. He's huge. He is an impressive looking edge. But he's athletic. But he's an interesting story. He was an inside linebacker at Cal for 2 or 3 years. Went to UCLA in a transfer portal, and they made him an edge. So he's really you know not developed all the repertoire. So he's kind of a wild card. But like you said, he's unsigned, and I don't know when these second round picks are going to get. I knew last year was bad when teams were giving some guaranteed money in year four, but then this year when Chicago and Cleveland gave fully guaranteed fourth years to the 33 and 34 spots, it kind of screwed everything. There you go, Cleveland screwing up contracts again.
There we
Yeah.
go. There we go. What about their day three picks? So you've got
Winston.
DK,
Oh,
you've got Gunnar Helm. Oh, go ahead. You were talking about Winston.
well, the thing about Winston is he's coming off that ACL, so it's all going to be health related with him. I mean, he could like days by the end of the year slide into one of that safety role. But again, he hasn't done anything in minicamp because he hasn't been cleared yet. Word is he'll be cleared for training camp, but again, it's medical, so we all know how that goes. So
Yeah. And then on their day three, okay, DK, tight end Gunnar Helm out of Texas, receiver Alec Ayamanor, Jackson Slater, guard, cornerback Marcus Harris, running back Mullings. Are any of those day three guys expected to contribute much in 2025?
well, I think yeah, they are. I mean, DK is pretty much going to be um he is going to be, their primary return person from what it looks like because he's experienced there. But he adds a dimension to the slot that they didn't have last year. Last year they had Tyler Boyd in the slot, who was a shell of the receiver he was in Cincinnati. DK is slotted to go there, I think, with Tyler Lockett, but that was kind of Lockett really didn't take part in a lot of the mini camp. They held, one of the changes I told you, Callahan made some changes. One of them was he let his veterans kind of lead, but let the young players get all the reps. So, you know, almost all the highlights you saw were Ward to, DK, Ward to Ayamanor. You had a lot of those young players taking a ton of reps in minicamp. And I think and Callahan's even said because he wants to speed up their development process. So I think he's thinking that they're going to, have some sort of role like Mullings. Mullings, I think, is going to be their short yardage back. I mean, their running back coach has already kind of talked about it. Again, he's not done anything in minicamp because he had offseason surgery on his abdomen. But they want to get him, in pads because that was an area they struggled last year. They couldn't convert 3rd and 1, 4th and 1, short yardage at the goal line. So what do? You go out and draft a former linebacker who just happened to be converted to running back and actually be successful at Michigan. Um, Slater is a funny story because I don't think he makes a huge impact this year unless there's an injury, but I think he's earmarked to be a starter in the future. But he actually had the highest Madden grade of all their rookies, which was kind of ironic. You know, he actually got a pretty good kick out of that on Twitter or X, whatever. So, but that's pretty good. And Harris could be a surprise too, especially because you'd have no idea what's going to happen with L'Jarius Sneed. He still hasn't done anything since last year. He's been out all off season too. So, I mean, they could get a lot of this draft class could get played. And then I'm gonna throw one out there to you. They as an undrafted rookie, they signed Xavier Restrepo, who was Ward's favorite target at Miami.
That's right.
And he has looked outstanding in minicamp. He fell out of the draft because of terrible combine.
Oh, his combine was so bad. So bad.
Well, that was the same thing with Gunnar Helm. He fell because of his combine.
Well, and
Both
Helm at least, like Helm he was hurt.
injured.
He
He had
ran despite the injury.
right. Restrepo, I have no idea how a wide receiver runs a 4.8, was a 4.84 or
It was
4.83.
so bad. Oh my gosh.
I mean, in my youth, 30 years ago, I wasn't far off from a 4.8, 5, that's like a 4.9, back in my football days,
But
but
he like Restrepo is so physical as well. That's if he
and
can create separation, like if he can get any separation at all. Yeah, he was a guy, like honestly, if it weren't for the combine, I thought he was probably a day 2 pick. But then
I
that
did
combine is
I did too, but you know what though? I'm seeing video, and it's not just the edited video because in minicamp you have like all the reporters taking everything. Restrepo doesn't look like he must be one of those guys that might run a 4.8 whatever 40, but he runs a 4.7 40 in pads. You know what I mean? He plays faster than his measurables, and that could be a steal for them.
yeah.
Especially bringing Ward along to have that kind of chemistry already. That is, we'll find out in training camp. When the pads go on and we get into, um, they're doing something different this year too. With they're doing back-to-back weeks of joint practices. First week with Tampa, second week with Atlanta. So Titan fans should be able to get a good gauge early with like real reps, on some of these young players and how they're going to, pan out. And we should find out early on with Restrepo. I think that I think that first preseason game, because he's undrafted rookie, he's going to see a lot of playing time, and that could make or break him making a spot, having a spot on his roster. So
Coming up next on the Raise OC Red podcast, the best Arizona Cardinals talk on the web. Let's move in HUD and look at their 2025 season. What can we expect from Tennessee in 2025? That's coming up next on the Rise OC Red. We're back on the Rise OC Red podcast, the best Arizona Cardinals talk on the web. Tennessee, after 3-14 year, they reload in free agency, shore up the offensive line. They have a new quarterback, draft a bunch of guys. What do you expect? What are reasonable expectations for this Titan team? And where do you think their floor and ceiling is?
I expect them to go to hover around 500. I think their ceiling, That's a tough question because they have a really weak schedule. Not only is the AFC South one of the weaker conferences or divisions in the NFL, because every team in that division has some major question marks heading into the season. Um, you know, I think their ceiling is 9 wins. Sliding that 9-7 maybe, just because of the weak schedule and the division they play in. The ball bounces the right way. They steal a game here, steal a game there, and they're right there.
And Cam Ward
Um,
looks more
more,
like Jaden Daniels than
really,
Caleb Williams.
yeah. Um, their floor, I want to say an improvement. So probably 4 5 wins is their floor.
Yeah,
Four
that
or
makes
five
sense.
wins is their floor.
But
Um,
I'm perfectly aware that you can have a team that's terrible one year and looks better the next year, but doesn't win more games. The Cardinals in 2022 were a dumpster fire 4-win team, and then their first year with Jonathan Gannon as a head coach in 2023, they were a good bad team. They were a good 4 wins because they were
right,
competitive.
right, and that's what I was saying about this Titan team last year. Um, they were competitive, and then the
They were a
injuries
good
piled up.
3-win team.
They were they. I'll tell you this. I know people make the excuses. Well, if he doesn't throw an interception, or that penalty doesn't get called, but really, they had the Vikings on the ropes, were leading, and then there was this crazy, or was it the Ram? I think it was the Vikings game. They got, I mean, the officials refused to answer questions about this penalty call, where they basically handed the game over. It was it was a play in the end zone, clean hit. They called, unsportsmanlike penalty, and that changed the entire complexion. They lost by like a field goal, but that they stop them with that play. That's a game there. That's a win there. The Chicago game, they didn't give up an offensive touchdown, and they lose to the Bears because of a pick six and like a fumble that sets up, I think there were two pick sixes in Chicago didn't score a touchdown. They kicked a couple field goals. But I mean, it was like, this is a team, like I said, that was leading going into the fourth quarter. I think like 4 of the first 5 games, they ended up winning against the Dolphins. But they were, like I said, they didn't really get blown out. They got crushed by Detroit and you Buffalo. But those are games they should have got crushed. I mean, honestly, they were not nearly as good as those two teams. I'm not gonna say they were a good 3 or 4 team, but they were a better 3 or 4 team than, you know, they were better than Cleveland last year. 'Cause I watched a lot of Cleveland football last year as well, and they got the first pick because of what, the strength of schedule, but they were a better football team than Cleveland. So I have a little bit of hope. Like I said, I think they're going to improve. I think, the low end 4 or 5 wins. I think 9 wins is probably their peak this year. But crazy things happen.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the NFL. It's all gonna be. We're gonna find out early.
Yes,
Their
it's true.
schedule,
That's true.
their schedule is really front loaded. I mean, they open with on the road at Denver. That game is going to tell a lot of things. If they could go into Denver and be competitive, they could have a decent season. If they go into Denver and get blown out, it could be a long season. So we'll find out early.
It's true. How do you view the game against the Cardinals? Is that a game where you're like a hopeful win, probably a loss, or one where you say, yeah, they're going to win that game? Now they are
I
in Arizona for that one.
They
To be
are in
fine.
Arizona. I think I view that game as a toss up, right? I mean, I don't know a ton about the Cardinals. I mean, I watched them a couple times last year. But from just looking at the schedule, there are games I definitely have as losses. This is one where I think it could go either way. But it all depends on, like I said, I'd probably have a better gauge after watching that Denver game because they got to travel to Denver. If they go out to Denver and lay an egg, then you know what? That could very well be a loss, just right off the bat. Because, it is a young team. They did bring these veterans in to help, but, it is a young team. That was the other thing that shocked me. I saw a stat where they're going to have like the second oldest starting lineup in the NFL, or like fifth oldest. And it's like, but when you look at them, it's like, really? But then, Jeffrey Simmons is almost 30. It doesn't seem like he's that old, but he's almost 30. So, but we're only talking, I think, a few years. I mean, a few points. I think their average starting lineup is going to be like 26.1, and which is still young.
Yeah, it is. It is.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Awesome.
yeah.
With that, thank you very much, Mark, for your time. That'll wrap up this edition of the Rise of Spirit podcast, the Best Our Cardinals Talk Love. You can find Mark's work over at Titans Wire, our USA Today sister site, and you can also find him on the Twitter, the X at Scarlet Circus. If you want, though, I'm looking at here. There's a little bit of Titan stuff there, a little bit of other stuff that you write, but awesome. So, Mark, I appreciate the time. Listeners, you can catch his work over at the Titans Wire, our sister site there. And that'll wrap up this edition of the Rise of Spirit podcast, Mr. Cardinals Talk on the Web. We will be back with more opponent previews. Thanks for listening as always. We'll be back again soon.
Thanks for listening to the latest edition of the Rise Up, See Red podcast. Listen to previous episodes and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Audioboom, or many other podcast platforms so shows are delivered directly to your mobile device. Please give the show a 5-star rating and always support the sponsors who support the show. We'll be back soon for the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Rise up, Red Sea, be red, see red, and of course, rise up, see red.
Rise up! Rise!